There are moments in the long and often inglorious history of American diplomacy when the mask slips, when the carefully constructed language of engagement and negotiation is suddenly discarded in favor of something rawer, more primal, and infinitely more dangerous. We witnessed precisely such a moment on the 14th of May, 2026, when the President of the United States of America, the most powerful nation on earth by every conventional military and economic metric, took to his social media platform and informed the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran that it had a simple choice before it: reach a deal on American terms or face annihilation. That single word, annihilation, carries within it a weight that no serious analyst of international relations can afford to treat casually. It is not diplomatic language. It is not the language of a negotiating party that believes it holds a strong hand and wishes to press its advantage through careful calibration of pressure and incentive. It is the language of desperation dressed in the clothing of dominance, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding where this conflict is actually headed. Let us be precise about what happened and why it matters so profoundly for the trajectory of not merely this conflict, but the entire architecture of international order that governs relations between states. Donald Trump, 75 days into a war that was supposed to produce regime change in Tehran within weeks, a war that was launched with the full confidence of an administration that believed its overwhelming military superiority would translate swiftly and cleanly into political outcomes, has now resorted to existential threats delivered through a social media post. This is not a sign of strength. It is a sign that the carefully constructed assumptions upon which this entire military enterprise was built have proven to be dangerously, perhaps catastrophically, incorrect. And the word annihilation, deployed publicly against a nation of nearly 90 million people, does not merely reflect frustration, it reshapes the entire diplomatic landscape in ways that make a negotiated settlement significantly more difficult to achieve, regardless of what either side actually wants. To understand why Trump's ultimatum is so strategically consequential, we need to understand the precise moment in the negotiations at which it was delivered. On the 15th of May, 2026, today, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stood before reporters and confirmed something that Washington had been reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The two sides have reached what Araghchi described as a near deadlock on the question of uranium enrichment. His precise formulation is worth examining carefully because it reveals the depth of the impasse. The subject of Iran's enriched material, he said, is a very complicated one, and the two sides have come to the conclusion that since it is very difficult, we are almost in a deadlock on this particular question. They have agreed to postpone it to the later stages of negotiations. Read that sentence again slowly, because what it actually describes is not a tactical delay in a smoothly progressing negotiation. It is an admission that the central issue, the one issue that the United States identified from the beginning as its absolute, non-negotiable red line, has proven impossible to resolve. Everything else in these negotiations is secondary. The nuclear question is primary. And the nuclear question is, by Iran's own foreign minister's admission, in deadlock. This is the context in which Trump's deal or be annihilated statement must be understood. It was not issued from a position of diplomatic confidence. It was issued on the same day that the nuclear deadlock became publicly undeniable, in the same news cycle that confirmed the central objective of this entire military enterprise remains as far from resolution as it was when the first bombs fell on Iranian soil 75 days ago. The timing is not coincidental. It is the response of a political leader who has committed enormous resources, military, financial, reputational, to an enterprise whose core objective is slipping away and who has chosen escalatory rhetoric as a substitute for strategic clarity. This pattern is not new in the history of American foreign policy. It is, in fact, deeply familiar, and its historical precedents are not encouraging. But what happened next in Washington was, in some ways, even more significant than Trump's public threat because it revealed the extent to which the domestic political consensus necessary to sustain this war is fracturing in real time. On May 15th, the House of Representatives voted on a war powers resolution that would have required the administration to seek congressional authorization for the continuation of military operations against Iran. The vote ended in a tie, 212 to 212. In procedural terms, a tied vote is a failed vote, which means the resolution did not pass. But the political meaning of that tied vote is precisely the opposite of what a failed vote normally implies. Nearly half of the House of Representatives, including 3 Republican members who broke with their own party leadership, voted to constrain the executive's authority to wage this war. Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Tom Barrett of Michigan crossed the aisle, and their defection very nearly produced a majority. This is not a marginal development. This is a leading indicator of a political environment that is shifting beneath the administration's feet, and it is shifting in a direction that further undermines whatever leverage Trump imagines he possesses in his confrontation with Tehran. The strategic implications of this domestic political fragility cannot be overstated, and they deserve careful examination before we proceed to the international dimensions of today's developments. Iran's negotiating position, whatever its apparent rigidity on the nuclear question, is informed by a sophisticated reading of American domestic politics. Tehran has been watching the erosion of Republican unity on this war with the same careful attention that any rational adversary would devote to signs of weakness in its opponent's political rear. Every Republican senator who expresses reservations, every House member who crosses party lines to support a war powers constraint, every public opinion poll that shows declining American support for the conflict, all of these register in Tehran as confirmation that time, in some important respects, is on Iran's side. This does not mean that Iran is comfortable with its current situation. The destruction it has absorbed over 75 days of intensive American and Israeli bombardment is real, severe, and will take years to repair. But a government that believes its adversary's domestic political support is crumbling has different incentives in a negotiation than one that believes it faces an opponent with unlimited political will and unlimited public patience. There is a historical parallel here that is so precise as to be almost uncomfortable to invoke, because historical parallels always risk oversimplifying the specific complexities of any particular situation. But the parallel to the American experience in Vietnam, and specifically to the period between 1968 and 1973, when the United States was simultaneously escalating military pressure on North Vietnam and conducting peace negotiations in Paris, is genuinely illuminating. The Nixon administration, like the Trump administration today, was caught between the political imperative to appear strong and decisive and the strategic reality that its military power was not producing the political outcomes it had promised the American public. Nixon's response was escalation. The Christmas bombings of December 1972, the mining of Haiphong Harbor, the expansion of the air war into Cambodia and Laos. These escalations produced tactical military results. They did not produce a favorable political settlement. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 represented an American acceptance of terms that, in most essential respects, recognized the failure of the military strategy that had preceded them. The word annihilation that Trump deployed on May 14th echoes, in its rhetorical register, if not its precise content, the logic of escalatory pressure that Nixon employed. And the results of that logic, as history has recorded them, were not what those who deployed it had hoped for. However, this is where the situation becomes far more dangerous than even this historical parallel suggests, because the Iran of 2026 is not the North Vietnam of 1972 in one critically important respect. North Vietnam did not possess or seek to possess nuclear weapons. The entire rationale for the American military campaign against Iran, the justification that was offered to the American public, to American allies, and to international institutions, was the prevention of Iranian nuclear weapons capability. This is the issue that is now, by Iran's own foreign minister's admission, in deadlock. The administration cannot accept a settlement that leaves Iran's nuclear program intact and capable of rapid weaponization, because such a settlement would represent the complete negation of the war's stated purpose. Iran, for its part, cannot accept the complete dismantlement of its nuclear program under military duress, because doing so would signal to every other government in the world that possessing or pursuing nuclear weapons capacity is the only reliable guarantee against the kind of military assault Iran has just endured. The two positions are not merely far apart. They are, in their current formulation, structurally incompatible. And it is into this structurally incompatible negotiating environment that Trump has now introduced the word annihilation. What most analysts are still failing to understand is what this deadlock on the nuclear question actually means for the broader trajectory of the conflict, and why the apparently technical dispute over uranium enrichment carries within it the seeds of a genuine escalation that could produce consequences far beyond anything that the architects of this war contemplated when they launched it. If the nuclear question cannot be resolved through negotiation, and the evidence of today strongly suggests it cannot be resolved quickly or easily, then the United States faces a stark choice between two options, each of which carries severe costs. The first option is to accept a settlement that leaves Iran's nuclear program in a condition that Washington considers unacceptable, which means accepting the political embarrassment of a war that failed to achieve its primary objective. The second option is to resume intensive military operations against Iran's nuclear facilities. Operations that would require a level of sustained bombardment far exceeding anything that has occurred so far, would produce civilian casualties on a scale that would be politically toxic domestically and internationally, and would risk triggering Iranian responses that could draw in regional powers and potentially global ones in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict or control. Neither option is good, and the rhetorical escalation embedded in the word annihilated has made the path to the first option, the negotiated settlement, significantly more difficult to navigate politically, even as the costs of the second option, resumed military escalation, remain as severe as ever. The international dimensions of today's developments add layers of complexity to an already extraordinarily complicated strategic picture, and they deserve the same careful, unhurried examination that the domestic American political dynamics merit. We must begin with the most important international development of the day, one that has received less attention than it deserves precisely because it is somewhat technical in its presentation, but profound in its strategic implications. The United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio has publicly called on China to do more to help end the Iran war. This statement, delivered on the same day that Trump threatened Iran with annihilation, represents a remarkable diplomatic moment, one that illuminates with unusual clarity the extent to which Washington's strategic position in this conflict depends on variables that lie entirely outside its control. China's role in this conflict has been the subject of considerable commentary, but much of that commentary has missed what is most significant about Beijing's posture. China has not been a neutral bystander to the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. It has been an active, sophisticated, and extraordinarily patient participant in the broader strategic competition that this conflict represents. Chinese-owned vessels have been permitted to transit the Strait of Hormuz under Iran's management protocols, while American ships remain subject to the blockade. Chinese diplomatic support at the United Nations has provided Iran with crucial cover against international isolation. And the confidential American intelligence assessment that emerged yesterday, one that described China systematically exploiting the war to maximize its advantage over the United States across military, economic, and diplomatic dimensions simultaneously, suggests that Beijing's involvement in this situation is far more deliberate and far more consequential than its public posture of concerned neutrality implies. Rubio's call for China to do more is, when read in this context, not merely a diplomatic appeal, it is an acknowledgement of dependency, an admission that the United States cannot resolve this conflict on terms favorable to its interests without Chinese cooperation that Beijing has shown no meaningful inclination to provide. This dependency has a specific and deeply ironic character that deserves explicit recognition. The Trump administration launched this war, in part, as an expression of American unilateral power, a demonstration that the United States could achieve its security objectives in the Middle East without the kind of multilateral coalition building and international institution engagement that the previous administration had favored. The go-it-alone confidence that characterized the planning of Operation Epic Fury was a direct expression of the administration's belief in the sufficiency of American military power. 75 days later, the Secretary of State is publicly asking China, America's primary geopolitical rival, the country whose growing power is the central preoccupation of American grand strategy, to intervene diplomatically to help end a war that American military power alone has proven unable to conclude on favorable terms. The distance between those two positions, the self-confident unilateralism of February 28th and the implicit multilateral appeal of May 15th, is a measure of how much the strategic assumptions underlying this war have been tested by contact with reality. The situation in Lebanon adds another dimension of complexity to an already intricate picture, and it connects to the broader question of whether the diplomatic framework that is emerging from this conflict will prove durable or merely cosmetic. On May 14th and 15th, the United States hosted 2 days of talks between Israel and Lebanon in Washington. Those talks produced an agreement to extend the existing Lebanon-Israel ceasefire for 45 days, with the next round of political negotiations scheduled for June 2nd and 3rd. The State Department described the talks as highly productive and announced that a second, security-focused track would be launched through the Pentagon beginning May 29th, featuring military delegations from both countries. This is, on its surface, a positive development, evidence that at least one dimension of the broader regional conflict is moving, however haltingly, toward a political resolution. But what happened next was even more significant, because it revealed the extent to which the various threads of this conflict are intertwined in ways that make progress on any single front conditional on progress across all fronts simultaneously. Iran has consistently insisted that Lebanon must be included as part of any comprehensive ceasefire agreement covering the broader regional conflict. This condition is not a negotiating tactic. It reflects a genuine strategic calculation on Tehran's part, the understanding that a Lebanon-Israel settlement that occurs independently of and prior to a U.S.-Iran settlement would deprive Tehran of one of its most significant pieces of leverage in the broader negotiation. Hezbollah, whatever its current military condition after months of Israeli strikes, remains Iran's most important regional partner and the most powerful single instrument of Iranian influence in the Arab world. A Lebanon settlement that stabilizes the northern Israeli front without addressing Iran's core demands in its direct confrontation with Washington is, from Tehran's perspective, a settlement that serves American and Israeli interests at Iranian expense. This is why Iran has maintained its linkage between Lebanon and the broader regional ceasefire, and it is why the 45-day extension of the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire, while genuinely useful as a humanitarian matter, does not by itself represent meaningful progress toward the kind of comprehensive regional settlement that would be necessary to end this conflict definitively. The economic costs of this war are accumulating at a pace that is beginning to generate political pressures that neither side can indefinitely absorb, and the economic dimension of this conflict deserves more sustained attention than the drama of military operations and diplomatic ultimatums typically allows. The Trump administration is draining the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve at the fastest pace ever recorded, 8.6 million barrels in a single week, a record that surpasses even the emergency drawdowns of the Biden administration during the 2022 energy crisis. Average gasoline prices in the United States now stand at $4.52 per gallon, according to ADLA. A level that is politically painful in a country where the price of fuel is one of the most immediate and viscerally felt measures of economic conditions for ordinary citizens. The Producer Price Index rose 6% for the 12 months ending in April, a figure that reflects in significant part the elevated energy costs that the Iran war has generated. And the global shipping giant Hapag-Lloyd reported a loss of €219 million in the first quarter of 2026, citing the war's disruption of global trade routes as a primary contributing factor. These are not abstract economic statistics. They are the material expression of a conflict whose costs are being distributed across the entire global economy, and they are generating political pressures in countries far from the Persian Gulf that are beginning to shape the diplomatic environment in which this war will eventually have to be resolved. But this next development completely changes the calculus of the conflict in ways that Washington has not yet fully absorbed. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in an interview with CBS News, announced that he wants to reduce American military support from its current level of $3.8 billion annually to zero, saying explicitly, "I think it's time that we weaned ourselves from the remaining military support." This statement, coming from the leader of the country that is America's most intimate partner in this war, is so striking in its implications that it deserves very careful interpretation. Netanyahu is not merely expressing a preference for Israeli strategic autonomy, though that preference is genuine and long-standing. He is also, in a more immediate and tactical sense, positioning Israel for the post-war diplomatic environment, signaling to Arab interlocutors, and particularly to the UAE leadership, with which he has just concluded what his office calls a historic breakthrough, that Israel's relationship with the United States is evolving in ways that give Israel greater freedom of maneuver in the region. The reported deployment of an Israeli Iron Dome battery to the UAE, a development that CNN confirmed earlier this month, is the concrete expression of this strategic repositioning. Israel is building direct security relationships with Gulf Arab states that do not require American mediation and that create a new regional architecture of partnerships whose full implications are only beginning to become visible. The UAE's public posture on the Iran war is itself a masterclass in the kind of sophisticated, multidirectional diplomacy that small but wealthy and strategically positioned states have always practiced in periods of great power competition. The UAE struck Iranian oil infrastructure covertly during the conflict, an action that was not authorized by or coordinated with Washington. It accepted an Israeli Iron Dome battery and Israeli military personnel to operate it, a development that would have been unimaginable even 2 years ago. Its senior officials have publicly called for a political solution through negotiation, and its diplomatic advisor posted on social media about the importance of a political solution at precisely the moment when Netanyahu's covert visit to the UAE was being publicly acknowledged. The UAE is simultaneously a partner of the United States, a new security partner of Israel, and a state that maintains economic and diplomatic channels to Iran and China. It is pursuing its own interests with a freedom that reflects its accurate reading of a genuinely multipolar strategic environment, one in which American hegemony is no longer sufficient to determine the behavior of even its closest regional partners. And if you think the full implications of today's developments are already visible, the most consequential dimension of what is unfolding may still be ahead of us. The nuclear deadlock that Iran's foreign minister described today is not merely a technical obstacle in a negotiation that is otherwise progressing. It is the central fault line of the entire conflict, and how it is resolved, or fails to be resolved, will determine not only the outcome of this particular war, but the broader question of nuclear proliferation that is one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. If Iran emerges from this war with its nuclear program intact and with the demonstrated knowledge that it can withstand a major American military assault, the lesson that other states will draw from that outcome is unambiguous and deeply alarming for the long-term stability of the non-proliferation regime. If Iran is compelled, through continued military pressure, to dismantle its nuclear program entirely, it will do so only under conditions of coercion that will make any resulting agreement extremely fragile and that will generate regional resentments with consequences lasting decades. There is no clean outcome available in this situation. There is only the question of which of the available bad outcomes is least bad, and that question is one that the architects of this war appear never to have seriously engaged before they launched it. The word annihilated will not age well. History has a way of making the rhetorical excesses of political leaders in moments of strategic frustration look, in retrospect, both more revealing and more consequential than they appeared at the moment of their utterance. Trump's ultimatum to Iran, delivered on a day when the nuclear deadlock became publicly undeniable and the domestic political consensus for the war fractured visibly in the House of Representatives, is a document that future historians will examine carefully when they attempt to reconstruct the decision-making process that produced whatever outcome this conflict eventually reaches. It reveals a great deal about the internal pressure the administration is under, about the gap between the objectives it set for itself and the results it has achieved, and about the difficulty of translating overwhelming military capacity into the specific political outcomes that military power was deployed to produce. These are not new problems in the history of American foreign policy. They are, in fact, among the oldest and most persistent problems in that history. But their persistence does not make them any less urgent to confront clearly and honestly, which is perhaps the most important service that serious analytical commentary can render at a moment when the temptation to mistake rhetorical escalation for strategic strength is, on all sides, very great indeed. The path forward, if one exists, runs through exactly the kind of patient, sophisticated, multilateral diplomatic engagement that the current administration has consistently disparaged and avoided. It requires acknowledging that Iran's security concerns are real, even if its methods of pursuing them are unacceptable. It requires engaging China not as an adversary to be pressured and blamed, but as an indispensable participant in any stable regional security architecture. It requires accepting that the outcome of this war will not look like the objectives with which it was launched, that the gap between ambition and achievement must be managed honestly rather than obscured by escalatory rhetoric. And it requires, above all, the recognition that the word annihilation, whatever its intended effect on Iranian decision-making, has made every one of these necessary steps harder to take. That is the true cost of today's ultimatum. Not the military cost, not the economic cost, but the diplomatic cost of words that close doors rather than open them, at precisely the moment when open doors are what this situation most urgently requires.